What's up, guys? We're back. All right, so I've covered an introduction to the 7-point singleton old school format, and now I felt it was time to actually do a deck tech. And this actually is not a deck that I built. This deck was built by Mikl, a Frenchman who went undefeated in the Swiss rounds. His last name eludes me, unfortunately, right now. I'll probably put it down in the comments or the title of the video when I can dig it up. But what you do need to know is that the way that the tournament was structured, there were 5-man pods. So maybe there were 6-man pods, and a whole bunch of 6-man pods. And in the Swiss rounds, or I guess it's the equivalent of the Swiss rounds, although it's actually round robin, you play everybody in your pod. And Mikl went 5-0, 10-0. That's right, he did not lose a single game with his pink weenie deck. And as soon as the pod rounds were over, and he had gone 5-0, the tournament organizer announced to the group that he had gone 5-0 and actually published his deck list right away. And I was still playing my pod matches, but I had an opportunity to go and look at his deck. I was really impressed by it. And because I was hopeful that I would make top 8 myself, I was pretty confident that if he had gone 5-0, 10-0, he was due to go deep into the top 8 as well. And there was a good chance that he and I would have to play. So I built his deck, happened to have pretty much all the cards on hand, and did a bunch of playtest games against it, learned a lot about how it performed, what to really be most cautious about and careful about, and which things were more innocuous. But I felt like I could give a little breakdown of what was actually in the deck and talk a little bit about the individual card choices, as well as, of course, his 7-point allowance. So I'm gonna just start in the upper left-hand corner, and I'm actually gonna go across this alphabetically and deal with lands second. So starting in the upper left-hand corner, we have Ayla Pyle, a card that most people probably would be stressed or hard-pressed to even figure out what it does if you were to tell them what it is. But if anybody had played Magic way back in 1996 during the famous Necro Summer era, Ayla Pyle actually was a very, very common fixture in mono-black decks and even in some green-white lists as well. The format back then was kind of defined by 2 different archetypes. The mono-black archetype, which used, pretty much every good black card in the format at the time, including Hymn to Torak, Hypnotic Spectre, Mind Twist, Pump Knights, and of course, Necropotence, as well as Nivenral's Disc. And then its counterpart was a green-white deck, which utilized primarily the interaction of Urnam Jin, which was legal because it was printed in Chronicles, as well as Armageddon, Acceleration in the form of Felwar Stones and Elves, White Removal, and a few other little nifty things like Sylvan Library and tons of artifact kill. But both the decks actually wanted to run Ayla Pyle, and the reason is because the green-white decks ran Whirling Dervish, and sometimes actually would even run Order of Leapbore, and both of those creatures are pro-black and can give the mono-black deck real trouble. And conversely, the mono-black deck ran its own Pump Knights, which were pro-white, which gave the green-white deck problems. And Ayla Pyle solved both of those problems. People also ran Serrated Arrows, some main deck and some sideboard, but Ayla Pyle, given the fact that it deals 2 damage and only costs 2 mana, was super flexible and showed up in a lot of lists, including my own. I actually qualified for a number of Pro Tours running Ayla Pyle in my deck. Continuing on, got Army of Allah, which for whatever reason, this card has not been canceled yet by Wizards. maybe they'll cancel it in a subsequent pass if they do. But for now, it has a place in this red-white deck, and I think as far as the cards in the deck, this card is a little bit more iffy to me. It sort of requires you to have a critical mass of creatures, probably at least 3 guys on board to really get pure value out of it, because it does cost 3 mana, which would kind of make it analogous to a white Ball Lightning, but only when you have 3 unblocked creatures. Obviously, it can deal crazy damage when you've got 4 or 5 guys attacking, but in that kind of a situation, you've probably already got the game won anyway, and you don't really want to overextend that much anyway, given how many different sweepers there are in the format. So I think that Army of Allah, not really that good overall, but can occasionally just snatch a victory out of nowhere. First of the banders here is the little inconspicuous Banalish hero, which, I imagine most people watching this video have literally never had this creature in play. I certainly played it way back in the day in limited formats because of the banding ability, and I will talk more about banding as I get underway. Actually, maybe it's time to talk about it. So there are probably quite a few people who have heard about banding ability but have never actually used it. And the way that banding works is, I view it kind of as glue. If you view any creature with banding as having sort of a little blob of glue attached to it, and the bander can attach itself, can glue itself to another creature that either has banding or doesn't. And when the creatures attack, they attack glued together. And when damage is assigned to the band is blocked as a whole. So a single creature can block a bunch of creatures all banded together. But the advantage is that unlike in a normal situation when damage is assigned, the person who controls the band gets to distribute the damage being dealt to the band however they choose. So if you're attacking with, say, Banalish Hero banded to this guy, a 1/3, you effectively have a 2/4 creature, and they have to deal 3 points of damage to actually kill anything here. If they only deal 2, you can just assign the 2 damage to the Dragon Engine, and both the creatures live. So banding, particularly when you get a number of banding creatures stuck together, becomes very, very problematic on offense, and it is really the most powerful and effective when it's actually used on defense. The reason is because the way that the defending rules work is that all you need is a single creature with banding on defense, and your entire blocking army, all of your creatures, as long as there's just one bander, effectively form one giant band to block. You can only attack with basically the number of banders plus 1, but you can defend with as many creatures as you want to as long as you have one bander, and you as the defender get to distribute all of the damage that you are blocking with that band amongst your guys. So you can get in these weird stalemates where you have a single banding creature, your opponent might have a giant monster in play, and they literally can't attack with anything because you can just block with your band, distribute all the damage, and lose nothing and kill their biggest guy. And banding was super confusing because of all the weird cases involving protection and trample and flying. And as more and more mechanics got added to the game, it just got more and more intricate and difficult to sort of parse as a player. It was particularly unfriendly to new players who just could not figure out how the ability worked and would constantly just throw their creatures away, not understanding how banding worked, particularly on defense. And the second component of banding, as well as the fact that it would just cause games to grind to a stalemate. Imagine you both have a few banders just sitting in play, and neither of you can really attack, and you're kind of just waiting around staring at each other until one person gets a flyer out and plinks the other person down. So I think it's those two primary reasons why banding was retired. It's still a really, really awesome and fun mechanic, and it works incredibly well in this deck. Moving on, Chain Lightning. Anybody who's played Old School, of course, is very familiar with this. One of the most efficient burn spells ever printed. It's not instant speed, and it can sometimes be redirected back on you, but for 3 damage for 1 mana, sorcery speed, I'll definitely take it. Of course, here's the Chaos Orb. This is the all-purpose removal spell in the format. It pretty much kills every permanent, as they haven't really made anything that's hexproof yet. The only drawback to Chaos Orb, of course, is that it is the one artifact in all of Magic that I know of that can be destroyed in response to its activation, because the current ruling of Chaos Orb is that you flip it onto the battlefield, and whatever it's touching after it resolves is destroyed, and you actually designate a single target, although there's some weird ambiguous stuff going on with whether or not it's actually targeted, and I'm not really sure if your opponent can respond to you targeting their thing, or once you activate it and you declare your target, they can't respond. I still need to look up the rules for that because it came up in my several matches that I played. But regardless, if you destroy the orb with an instant speed removal, primarily usually just Shatter, Disenchant, or Divine Offering, the orb will not actually have any effect. It will be removed from the battlefield before it successfully lands on anything, and that will cancel the effect, which is a very, very important thing to note, and it will come up in some of the games that I'm going to be doing commentary on later on. Got Detonate over here, which is a card you don't see very often. This is sort of more akin to a sideboard card, is that it's slow and narrow and an X spell, but it definitely goes with the overall theme of the deck, which is just basically punishing your opponent as much as possible, just putting as much damage on them as possible. And even a Detonate on something like a Felwar Stone can often be decisive, particularly because you can cut their tempo out and deal damage at the same time. Obviously, if you're detonating something bigger like a Jamde Tome or a 6-mana creature like a Triskelion or a Tetravis, it can be completely game-ending. And you just kind of need every good artifact kill spell that exists in the format, because by nature of it being singleton, there are a lot of extremely strong artifacts that are available, and Detonate pretty much handles all of them. Moving up here, of course, I don't need to really say much about Disenchant, the most flexible removal spell in Old School, and kind of a staple in really any deck with white, and one of the main reasons to play with white. So you can't really go wrong with Disenchant. It is one of the most important key pieces in the format. There's Disintegrate here, which is still unpointed, and just all-purpose X spell with the added benefit of being able to kill regenerators permanently. If you kill a creature with regeneration like a Sedge Troll, or maybe an Uthden Troll, and maybe Will-O-Wisp, Judge Skeleton, something like that, one of the rare regenerators in the format, Disintegrate exiles it, so it's gone from the game, they can't regrow it, and they can't regenerate it, which sometimes matters, and Most of the time, however, you're just sort of pointing this at a big creature, or you're pointing it at your opponent's face and killing them with it. But very useful to have. Can't really have enough X spells. Here's Divine Offering, which is again another card that you see usually in sideboards, although I run one main deck Divine Offering in my regular old school control deck. And added benefit of gaining life in a pinch. And sometimes all you can do to survive is kill your own artifact with Divine Offering, which is something I've done way more times than I can count, honestly. It comes up all the time and is very frequently the correct play, even when it's not actually something that's going to kill you. Sometimes just burning the Divine Offering to kill something like a Jam-Day Tome that they're killing, that 4-point life swing will counteract something like a Sonic Blast and might actually make the difference in winning the game. So always be looking for that when you're playing with this card. Here's Dragon Engine, 3 mana, 1/3. It's pumpable. This guy I feel is definitely on the kind of on the low end of the spectrum for cards in the deck, but I kind of do understand why Mikl elected to run it, just because he kind of wants to diversify his threats. It is immune to Abyss, it is pumpable, so it does give you a mana sink, both, late in the game, something to do with all your extra mana. And it just has 3 health, which is kind of good with all the banding creatures, and he doesn't really have a lot of creatures on 3, so it does give him a decent threat. I think probably, other than the casting cost, I think probably an Uthden Troll would have been better in this slot, or just not playing it at all. And we'll get to that later. Here's another X spell, Earthquake, which seems crazy to run in a deck with 1,000,001 toughness guys, but it is a finisher, and sometimes you're just really behind on board, and you can sweep away 3 of your opponent's guys with an Earthquake and get right back in the game. It is actually one of the few reset buttons that this deck actually contains, although it's unlikely to be in a situation where your opponent is miles ahead on board and you don't have anything, just given how many creatures there are. But that does come up sometimes, and again, more X spells is good when you're trying to kill your opponent quickly. Falling Star. Look at this, guys. When was the last time you saw a Falling Star in a tier 1 deck in the format? This card I literally have never had played against me until this event, actually. And it had a special ruling. The card is actually quite similar. It's funny that they wound up close together in terms of the alphabet. But Falling Star is the closest effect to it is something like Chaos Orb. The difference is that while Chaos Orb can destroy any permanent, Falling Star is limited to just interacting with creatures. However, due to a ruling that was played, because the way the card is supposed to work, if we read this lengthy text, it must turn at least 360 degrees, deals 3 damage to each creature that it touches. Any creature damaged by Falling Star that are not destroyed becomes tapped. So in order to not have to worry about board space, and obviously a card that cares about where things are when you're playing a game over the internet doesn't really work, over webcam, because like, who are you to say where the things are relative to each other? So the way that it was ruled in this format and the way that it's being played in the tournaments is that you can pick up to 2 targets, 2 creatures, and you actually have to flip the Falling Star. You can line them up side by side, and you can flip the Falling Star at both of them. And if you're very, very skilled at your flipping, as Mikl was in our match, you actually can hit both creatures and deal 3 to 2 things. And even if you don't kill them outright, it does tap them too, which is something that I did not know, because he flipped his Falling Star, and one of the targets was my giant tortoise. And after the Falling Star resolved, he told me that the tortoise was dead, and I was kind of astonished and puzzled. And I said, no, it's a 1/4. What are you talking about? But in fact, it would have died if I had actually played the card correctly, because it is tapped, and of course, Giant Tortoise only gets its 3 health bonus when it's untapped. So the Falling Star actually reduces it down to a 1/1 and then splatters it. But a very, very cool card in the deck. Even if you're not killing the guys, just the ability to tap 2 things and get through for more damage can often be decisive, and I think it's an excellent card in this deck. All right, first point card, Fireball. Again, I talked about this before when I was doing the points breakdown. This card shows up in so many decks and is, of course, right at home in this deck. And it only costs a single point to play it. Just pretty much the best X spell that's going to be made for quite some time. Karavic's Torch in Mirage, you can make an argument that it might be a little bit better because it's harder to counter. But the fact that Fireball can split onto multiple targets often makes it just the best X spell, period, until the uncounterable ones were made many, many years later. Granite Gargoyle. It's an interesting choice here. The deck is not running a ton of red mana, and a lot of the time this thing is basically just going to be a Windrake with the potential to pump its health by 1. So a 2/3 flyer for 3. It's very efficient in terms of the other creatures in the format. The problem with it is that it's just hard to play red things in this deck. The deck just doesn't run enough mountains, and it can't really afford to run many more mountains because of how many cards it has that cost double white and how few lands it's running in general, alongside 2 colorless lands. And as good as the Granite Gargoyle is, I feel like, yeah, maybe another white creature might have worked better here, although there really aren't a ton of good choices. He picked out pretty much all the good white creatures. But if you do have red, a 2/3 flyer for 3 mana is not bad at all in a format that just doesn't have a lot of flyers and doesn't have a ton of removal. All right, another bander, Acacian Infantry. So Fallen Empires actually really bolstered this archetype a ton. You wouldn't actually even know that if you played Pink Weenie in Old School, because if I think about it, really there aren't, with the exception of Order of Leapbor, which is from Fallen Empires, White Weenie just really didn't get a lot of help from that set. And most of the time people are going to be playing, if they're playing the archetype, they're going to be running 4 copies of Savannah Line, 4 White Knights, 4 Crusade, 4 Order of Leapbor, maybe some Thunder Spirits, a couple Serra Angels, Sword Splashers, Disenchant, and so on. And there just is no room for these smaller weenie creatures in white that were introduced in Fallen Empires. But in this deck, because of Singleton, you just can only play with one of those best things. And this creature really shines. Honestly, it's amazing. Both Banding and First Strike. Banding, of course, I already talked about, is a super amazing creature ability. And First Strike, particularly when attached to another creature with First Strike, just gives you a bigger first striking creature. If you glue this guy to an Order Leapbor, you glue him to a White Knight, now you've got a 3/3 first striker. And that is very, very problematic for a lot of creatures in the format to get through. And you can often just keep pushing damage in the situation where your opponent has blockers, but they can't really block in any way that makes sense. And they're just going to wind up having to take 2 or 3 or 4 damage every single turn, when ordinarily they'd be able to shut you down with something that was like a 3/4 creature. Acacian Javelineers. This is maybe another Fallen Empires creature that warrants inclusion in some regular White Weenie decks, just because the pinging ability is so good and he only costs 1. And yeah, it's just excellent card overall. A 1-drop that can pressure your opponent and then combine. You can see it flanked right here by both Chain Lightning and Lightning Bolt. Both of those cards combined with the Javelineer allows you to get up to that magical 4 damage threshold to kill things like Azure Drake and Serendip Freed and Sarah and Air Elemental and Sengir Vampire and just other problematic 4s. So really, really good, efficient card. One of the best creatures in the format, I think, actually. And then we got this guy, who I have tremendous respect for now, the mighty Acacian Lieutenant. Another card you would never, ever see normally played in White Weenie. But in this deck, this thing is a beast. It is a powerhouse. Look how many soldiers there are, actually. So we got Javelineers as a soldier. The Acacian Infantry as a soldier. This poor guy's not a soldier. But Acacian Scout up here is a soldier. For some reason, Pikeman, despite looking very much like a soldier, isn't a soldier. It's a Pikeman. Although maybe it's been errated to actually be a soldier as well. But regardless, the lieutenant himself is a soldier and can pump himself. So this thing is basically just another pump knight, and it costs 2 mana. Sure, his base stats are weaker. He's only a 1/2, but you can pump him up to 2/2 or 3/2 or 4/2 and so on. And once you've got a lot of mana in play, this guy gets really dangerous, and he can make all your other banding, first striking soldiers extremely difficult to deal with. Really, really excellent card in the deck, and one of the best creatures. And that brings me to another Acacian guy, the Acacian Priest, another card that I've never ever played against, but man, was this card problematic in testing. It just, if the opponent got Acacian Priest, it just becomes so difficult to deal with their guys in combat, particularly because of the banding ability and often with First Strike. It does seem like a high cost to pay, 3 mana to give +1/+1, but the fact that you don't have to do this, it's just a mere threat of the Acacian Priest, causes your opponent to just not be able to block anything. And you can often combine sort of these effects together. You get a Bander and a Priest and 2 First Strikers, and pretty soon you just have this ridiculously unstoppable offense assembled out of 1/1s. Very, very good card. I have tremendous respect for it, having played against it a bunch now. So I'm gonna move up to here. We've got Acacian Scout, kind of the weakest of the Acacian guys. Yeah, you can pay 1 mana and tap to give First Strike, but having to keep a creature back to give First Strike is fairly mediocre as opposed to the guys who just have it built in. And I don't know if there's any better 1/1s. There's like Clergy of the Holy Nimbus might be better than this guy because it actually has a regeneration ability. There's a few other 1/1s that he wasn't using. But again, you know, with banding and critical mass of First Strike, you can assemble an offense or a defense that becomes impenetrable, which is probably why it was run. One big advantage, however, of Acacian Scout now versus with the old rules is that back in the day, when Fallen Empires first came out, the rules dictated that a creature that was tapped could not deal damage. And now Acacian Scout can actually block and tap and give itself First Strike and still deal damage as a tapped 1/1. So that actually could be relevant. Moving down, he's got a Juggernaut here, and I think Juggernaut is probably the right inclusion. It's kind of between this guy and Su-Chi and whether or not maybe both creatures, like going down to the Dragon Engine. The Dragon Engine might have been better as a Su-Chi just because a 4/4 is just so much more effective than a 3 mana guy that's only a 1/3. Though, of course, he has to be conscious of mana curve, given that he's only running 22 land. But I do like Su-Chi a lot. It's definitely a staple in regular Old School, which means it's probably good enough for this format too. And Juggernaut, of course, fits into that same category and is actually quite a bit better, I think, in Singleton than it is in ordinary Old School, owing to the fact that there just aren't a million lightning bolts. In normal Old School, you'll face decks very frequently that run anywhere from 6 to 8 lightning bolts, things that deal 3 damage for 1 mana. And in this format, you know that by default, they can only run 1 of each. And that means that Juggernaut will often take down something much more valuable with it, or it'll just beat their face and kill them. All right, next point card, land tax. I've already talked about this before. If a deck was built to exploit land tax, it's this thing. Land tax is at its absolute best in a pink weenie deck. It's the kind of card where you can play it on turn 1, and you can just play the tax game from that point on. You can just deploy threats for 1 mana and force your opponent to play land in order to cope with what's going on. And having a deck full of 1 mana 1/1s seems goofy, but when you've got a land tax in play, that means you're going to be drawing 3 land a turn out of your deck, thinning it down into a streamlined killing machine, and all of that for the cost of 1 white. Definitely the strongest card in the whole deck, I think, and more than worthy of the 2-point allowance. Don't need to say much about Lightning Bolt. We all know how good this card is. Moving on to Mesa Pegasus, the humble little Mesa Pegasus, which you, again, would never ever see outside of limited formats. But in Old School Singleton, this thing's good too. It's not a soldier, unfortunately, so it's not pumpable except by anything but Acacian Priest, but it's a flying bander, which is a really, really rare thing. In fact, I think the next flying bander that gets made is the Teremko Griffin or something from Mirage. It took that long for another flying banding creature to show up. I might be getting the name wrong, but there's definitely a 2/2 flying bander in Mirage. I remember drafting it way back in the day on the Queen Mary. But this card is a smaller version of that, but 2 mana, flying, gets over moat, bans with the other stuff. There's really not much to not love about it. And that brings me to one of the best, most efficient creatures ever created, actually, and certainly for the White Weenie archetype. The Order of Leapor, which is kind of everything that you want in a White Weenie creature. It's an efficient 2/1 for 2 mana. It has protection from the color with the second most removal, and it's pumpable, and it has first strike. It just kind of does everything. It's strong early, it's strong late, it's a constant threat. It can break through walls and Mishra's factories and 4 health creatures, and in rare instances, it can even take down the Shivan Dragon. We'll get to that later. All right, Pikeman. Another banding first striker. This guy is also very good, and it's sort of self-explanatory. So powerful and potent when it's combined with another first striking creature. It just it's almost like, the card's honestly not that different from an equipment, but it's like an equipment that can just beat down and is a little bit more vulnerable. But basically, you just glue it to anything, and that creature gains first strike, +1/+1. Pretty good. All right, Preacher. God, this card's so good. Also very underutilized back in the day. It really shines in the Old School Singleton format, and presents a huge problem for really any opposing creature-based strategy. You can take any one of their guys, and while sure they get to choose what creature you take from them, that means that they have one of your guys untapped on their side of the board, and that kind of precludes being able to attack, because even if your creatures are bigger, you're going to be killing one of your own guys by attacking every single turn. They just untap the creature and steal something else. And that will find you with no creatures really quickly. And most people facing Preacher understand that they just have to kind of hang back and wait to deal with it. And sometimes that can take a while. For example, my deck has only a few spot ways to deal with Preacher. I think I only run 4. And if a Preacher's out there and he grabs a Serendib or something, I don't really have an easy answer for him. And even if you gain control of the weird thing is, if you gain control of the Preacher, I believe they still control the creature until you untap the Preacher, which is kind of a weird thing. But anyway, super powerful card. There is one interesting rules interaction that I'll talk about later in the commentary, but it's one of, I think, it might be the only card in the entire game where when you tap it, there are 2 targets declared simultaneously, one by the person who controls Preacher and one by the guy who's targeted by Preacher. So I activate Preacher. My opponent actually has to immediately target one of their available creatures as part of my activation. They can't respond by, say, flashing a creature into play and choosing that or something. They literally have to have the creature in play at that moment. And I actually did not know that in my finals match against Mikl. I was just assuming that I could activate, say, a Mishra's Factory or something in response and give him that, but that actually doesn't work that way, which is kind of an interesting little fluke of timing. Pyrotechnics seems pretty good. I ran this in my very, very first Type 2 deck back when that format was introduced, a red-white deck called Fury and Purity, and it was actually really, really awesome spell. Just compact burn, it's basically the same as a fireball, but the fact that you can fling the damage all around just obliterates opposing weenie strategies. So strong. Being able to take out 2 or 3 creatures of your opponents for 5 mana is often game-ending, and in a pinch, you can either send it at their face or blow up something like a Sarah or an Air Elemental or whatever. Very, very good burn spell. Savannah Lion, one of the absolute best creatures ever printed, at least up until they started making 2/1s for 1 white mana pretty much in every set in Magic. But for a long, long time, this guy was kind of the staple, the benchmark for an efficient creature. And it is obviously the best creature you can hope to ever have in your opening hand with this deck. Sarah Angel, kind of near the top end of the deck. It's the 5 mana 4/4, and it's a little hard to cast, of course, but it does have double white and just dominates the battlefield when it comes down. It is just, every time you play Sarah in Old School Singleton, you kind of are reminded of why this creature is so legendary and so revered. It just looms over the battlefield and nothing can attack when Sarah's in play. And meanwhile, it's just pounding your opponent in the face for 4. So strong, and definitely one of the best creatures in the deck. And moving down to the Shivan. So Shivan Dragon, of course, much ballyhooed. It was the ultimate chase rare. If we go back in time, 20, 26, 27 years. And I honestly think, this is maybe a little controversial, but I don't think this card belongs in this deck. The reason is because you're really kind of playing a weenie deck and you're trying to win the game quickly. And if the game goes long, you do have your burn spells to finish the game with. And the problem with the Shivan is that, first of all, it costs double red. It's the only card in the deck that does cost double red, and this deck often struggles to get a single red mana into play. On top of that, it gives your opponent a huge target to steal if they happen to have a control magic or a preacher. In addition to that, if they kill it, your opponent can reanimate it with Animate Dead, and it can just turn into a huge liability. In fact, there was a famous Pro Tour match played many, many years ago at Pro Tour LA #1. It was the second Pro Tour ever, and in the finals, Sean Regnier played against a guy named Tom Gavin. And Tom Gavin had this ridiculous deck. I think it was either black-red or green-red, and Sean Regnier's deck was blue-white. And Sean Regnier's entire strategy to beat Tom Gavin came down to power sinking Tom's Shivan and then reanimating it with Animate Dead and killing him. And that is literally how I think 3 of the games in the finals ended. Tom just couldn't resist playing the Shivan, and every single time it got countered and reanimated and killed him. So just a little piece of interesting Magic history. I think the card is super powerful in decks that run a lot more red, certainly like a blue-red deck or a mono-red deck, but I don't really think it belongs in this deck. It's just too clunky. If you draw it early, it's just like having a 6-card hand, and that's just not worth it in my opinion. All right, finally, Sol Ring. Look at that, a 4-point card. Mikl sort of forewent a ton of other good options at 1 and 2 points and decided to go all in on Sol Ring. And I think of all of his deck construction choices, this one baffled me the most. I just could not figure out why he decided that Sol Ring belonged in the deck. Given, I mean, look at it, like so many of the cards cost 1 white or even 2 white mana. And yeah, he's got some burn spells and stuff, but those are kind of late game anyway. Sol Ring is a card you want to draw early to really have an impact. And early, he just doesn't have that much stuff to do with it. I mean, he can play a Juggernaut, but Juggernaut's fairly easy to answer. He can't even play a Sarah or a Triskelion or Shivan Dragon until fairly late in the game anyway. And you draw Sol Ring a little late, it's really not that much different than a land. I mean, sure, it's 2 lands in 1, but it is generic mana, and you often draw Sol Ring when you're struggling for red. And I think that this is the one real glaring part of the deck that I think it was a mistake in deck construction. I just think that with a 4-point allowance, you better have a damn good reason to run a 4-point card in your deck, because you're just foregoing so much consistency and power to run it. And in all the testing games that I played, the Sol Ring was very mediocre in most of the games that it was drawn. And yeah, and you're suffering because you're just missing 4 points. So that's something I would definitely change. And I mean, you obviously can't argue with those results, but I don't think Sol Ring was instrumental to that. Okay, it's got Spirit Link, and this card is a bit of an anomaly in here. I think the card is incredibly powerful in the format and is often analogous to Sword Splashers and can sometimes even be better, particularly when you're playing it on your own guy and gaining life back. But this is a purely aggressive, low-to-the-ground deck, and Spirit Link thrown on something small like a 1/1 or a 2/2 is just not a good investment. So you're going to be primarily playing this as defensively on one of your opponent's cards, which means that you're investing in a card that they're going to just block with. And now they've got a blocker out and you can't attack anymore. And you've invested a card in their guy and now you can't attack. It seems to really just run counter what the deck is trying to achieve, given that it's a fast, aggressive deck. And as a result of that, I don't think that Spirit Link also belongs in the deck. Although, of course, I have mad respect for it. I ran it, of course, as a control deck, but I don't think it belongs in Pink Weenie. This card, however, we don't need to talk about that, goes in every deck with white, literally the best removal spell ever printed in Magic, and of course is an auto-include in this deck. Moving down to the one of the few cards on the reserved list that's actually in this build, the Mighty Thunder Spirit, which has a great place in the deck. 2/2 flyer, surprisingly tough to deal with, just given the fact that it has first strike, and there just aren't a ton of flyers in the format to oppose it, and it can combine with other first strikers to band together. Obviously, you can use things like Lightning Bolt in conjunction with Thunder Spirit or Ayla Pyle up there to deal extra damage in the air to take down big things in conjunction with first strike, or even with Triskelion. So quite solid, no-brainer include. And then the other 6-drop in the deck, which is the Triskelion. This card shows up in so many lists in Old School Singleton. I think it's definitely a powerhouse. I just feel like in this particular build, the Triskelion is a little bit too top end for what the deck is kind of trying to achieve. Once you've moved into the 6 mana range, you've already got access to all of these big red burn spells, and these burn spells have the added flexibility of being castable for less. Triskelion only costs 6 mana, and the deck's only running 22 land, which means, well, I guess, and a Soul Ring too, so that certainly makes it better. But the Triskelion requires you to draw quite a bit of your deck's entire mana. You have to draw roughly a quarter of your deck's entire mana to play it. And again, it's one of those cards, if you draw it in your opening hand, it's just going to be sitting dead for a long time. And I think that's a liability. I think I would have run something more in like the 3 to 4 range over this card. Something like, I don't know, the Knights of Thorn, 2/2 first striking banding. I'm sorry, 2/2 pro red banding, for example. Tundra Wolves, 1/1, kind of a little dork. I don't know if this guy's better than the Clergy of the Holy Nimbus, but it's actually, again, good with cards, banded cards like Pikeman, so you get that extra first striking. Of course, it's great on defense. And that is almost it for the spells. 2 spells to go. Wall of Swords, super amazing card. I love this card in the format, and I do not think this card belongs in the deck at all. I think that, again, it's just very antithetical to the strategy. If you're at a point in the game with this red-white deck where you are so far behind that a 3/5 flying wall is something you want to be drawing or playing, you've probably already lost the game anyway. And particularly because you don't have any sources of card advantage. There's no way to sort of sit behind the wall and grind out the game with card advantage. And yeah, maybe the wall's decent and that you can hold the line with it and build up mana for your X spells. But for 4 mana, just something like that Knights of Thorn, 2/2 banding pro red would just be so much better. Or something like Icy Manipulator, something that also costs 4 that you can use to push through your game plan. So a purely defensive card like Wall of Swords just doesn't make sense to me either. 2/2 White Knight. Obviously, this guy would be one of the very, very first cards you would add in Pink Weenie. It's just totally awesome and efficient. First strike, pro black, kind of does everything. All right, I'm just going to go over the lands real quick since this video has been going a while. City of Brass, it's basically like your second plateau that damages you. Mishra's Factory, best creature in all of Old School. Completely ridiculous card. Even as a singleton, it's often has huge impact on the game. The deck is running 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just 5 mountains, and a plateau over there. And then this interesting choice of running Pendelhaven, which of course just makes green mana, but man, is this card good in this deck. It was such a great choice by Mikl. I can't commend him enough for deciding to run Pendelhaven. I actually, when I saw it on the list, I just smiled and went, wow, that's really smart. That's just an awesome, I mean, obviously it's a colorless land, but being able to put +1/+2 on any of your creatures at instant speed is so good, particularly in conjunction with banding. It just makes any of the banding guys such a nightmare to deal with. A 2/3 bander is just so much stronger than a 1/1 bander, and you can often just force through so much extra damage. And of course, you can just pump your guys too with Pendelhaven. Great choice, great card. Really nice to see it in here. And then a bunch of planes: 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 planes, and that singular plateau. So in total, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Just 7 sources of red. You can see what I was talking about as far as why casting Gargoyle is tough, as well as Shivan Dragon. With only 7 sources of red, there's a lot of games where you just don't draw red. And I guess land tax is kind of quasi-red, but you can't always count on that. And I just think that, I don't know, maybe one more red mana or just cutting a few of the red spells would make the deck a little bit more streamlined and efficient. So with that in mind, I know I've talked at length about every spell in this deck, but I figured that what you guys might be interested in hearing at this point is how would I make any changes if I made any changes at all? And in fact, I do have some changes, and the total changes are 9 cards. And anyone who's listened through the entire length of this video might be able to guess at a few of the cards that I would remove. So I'm going to go over them right now. If you want, I'll give you a second to construct your own list and see how it compares to my own. I'm just going to go over it one more time. And you heard all my feedback on the various cards. So I changed a total of 9 cards in my version of this after extensive playtesting. So cutting Ayla Pyle, I know I talked a lot about this card, but I feel like this effect is kind of redundant in the deck and is a little bit kind of slow and clunky. And the deck tends to struggle against bigger creatures. So 2 points of spot removal just isn't that good because you have the ability to kind of use banding and first striking to deal with smaller creatures, and that's kind of what Ayla Pyle is good for. And when you're using Ayla Pyle in conjunction with your own guys to take down something bigger, sure, the thing is dead, but it's going to cost you often 2 cards, sometimes even 3. And with no way to get back into the game and no card advantage, you can't really afford to do that. And as a result of that, I think Ayla Pyle, as good as it is, does not belong. I also think Army of Allah, too inconsistent, requires you to overextend on the board. Sometimes does a lot of damage, sometimes sits dead in hand, and often just does nothing. Is also quite expensive in effect to keep untapped before you attack. So cut Army of Allah. I talked a lot of smack about Dragon Engine, and he is gonzo. Definitely don't think he's good enough for this deck. And moving on, so that's 3. The mighty Granite Gargoyle, as good as it is, I think is just not quite strong or flashy enough and doesn't further this deck's aims. I think something like a Suchi would just be better. Doesn't require red, is a 4/4, just way more damage and way more threatening. So I cut that guy. Moving on. All these I'm playing with. Ugh. Sorry, Shivan, you're out of here. I've said enough bad things about this creature in this deck, and yeah, to me, this is one of the easiest cuts. In all the testing that I did, and I played probably 50 games now total of my control deck against this deck, and the Shivan was uncastable so many of those games. I draw it all the time when I had no red mana in play, and it also, playing the other deck, of course, I would often just kill one of the red mana when I had an opportunity because he was getting close to casting Shivan Dragon. And the card would just sit marooned in my hand. It got stolen a bunch of times and I lost to it. It's just not that great in this deck. So that guy's gone. And then the biggest change of all, I think, structurally, is the removal of Soul Ring. I just don't think it's good enough in the deck to merit the 4-point budget. So I cut that, and I'll get to what I've replaced it with. Spirit Link, also kind of antithetical to what the deck is trying to achieve. It's just a purely defensive card, and you're not really interested in gaining life, and therefore, and giving your opponent a blocker. Just not really what the deck's trying to achieve, and therefore a pretty easy removal. And then finally, or not quite finally, Triskelion, card number 8 that I removed. And again, for the same reason as Shivan, obviously it's easier to cast, but with the removal of Soul Ring, the Triskelion just gets that much harder to cast. And I think that even though the effect is very powerful and the card is obviously excellent, it's a top tier card, it just, I don't think belongs in this kind of an archetype. So I removed Triskelion. And then, of course, easy choice of removing Wall of Swords, which was so discordant and strange that, to me, that was one of the absolutely easiest cuts. I left the mana exactly the same, so none of that changed. And now we get to the 9 cards that I replaced those 9 with. And I am going to reveal them now. All right, Anka Mishra, for one. Anybody who's played Old School, particularly in conjunction with this little guy down there, has faced the mighty Anka Mishra. This card is so brutal. It is so brutal in this format, particularly because there's so little artifact kill. And the fact that everybody, and no one's running Moxes, no one has tons of Fellwar Stones, no one has Soul Ring, there's just no way to really go about your game plan without playing land. And Anka Mishra just punishes the opponent. If you go turn 1 guy, turn 2 Ankh, you can pretty much almost win the game on the spot unless they remove it. They're gonna have to take so much damage, often 6, 8, sometimes 10 damage just to try to get their game plan enacted. And that is so ruthless when you're playing a deck that has tons of 1 and 2 drops. The card is just so good in this deck, it's absurd. Along those lines, I'm running Atog, which pretty much replaces something like the Granite Gargoyle. Sure, he's red and he's a little hard to cast, but at the same time, it doesn't cost double red, and Atog is ridiculous with all of the artifacts that the deck contains, mainly just because it's such a threat. Your opponent has to start blocking it often pretty early in the game, and you can just feed redundant artifacts like an Ankh that's already done 6 or 8 damage to them. You can sack a Black Vice to it, whatever. It's often just the untapped potential of Atog that's so scary. And mid to late game, you can often just attack and deal 7 or 9 to them in one hit with it, and that's pretty insane value for 2 mana. Black Vice. All right, so this is the first card that I've replaced points wise that I've replaced the 4 points from Sol Ring with. And Black Vice is so strong in this format that it feels almost unfair, and it's weird because it's a 2-point card, and I mean that's a lot of budget. But if you draw Black Vice early, it is just ridiculous. Any deck that isn't filled with cheap stuff will take, at a minimum, usually 9 damage, 10 damage from this card for 1 mana. It's crazy. How did this card even get designed? I mean, nobody understood how to build a mana base or how to do a mana curve or anything for the first few years that Magic was out. And every game that involved Black Vice or multiples of them must have been so miserable in playtesting. I just can't. I'll have to talk to Richard about it next time I chat with him. Actually, I have to call him tomorrow. I'm going to ask him about Black Vice and see if he has any recollection about how this card made it through the playtest gauntlet. But at 1 mana, and everybody just agrees, the card is just so unfun. It's just awful to play against. It feels so filthy to just kill your opponent with it. Totally insane, and absolutely worth the 2 points in a deck that's trying to be hyper-aggressive. And along the hyper-aggressive lines, there's Copper Tablet. This card is fantastic in this deck too. Both Ankh and Copper Tablet and Vice can just put your opponent in a position where no matter what they draw, they are just completely screwed. They're trying to answer your creatures and your burn, and meanwhile, they're just getting ripped to shreds by these artifacts too. And having lots of artifact damage is sort of enforces something I've talked about before, which is the idea of threat diversification. The more diverse your threats are, the harder it is for your opponent to answer them. And when you have white, red, and artifact-based threats and a lot of damage, there is no sort of simple solution. This original deck is almost completely solvable by Moat. Moat kills almost the entire deck. However, if you have Moat and your opponent gets one of those Vice, Ankh, Copper Tablet draws, well, who cares? You've got a 4-mana enchantment in your hand. You have to take at least, probably 6 damage just to get up to the mana to play the Moat. Meanwhile, Vice has been eating you and you're taking damage from Copper Tablet. And by the time you play Moat, you're at 4 and the game's already over. So having the diverse threats, I think, really, really elevates the deck. And then that brings me to this card, which of all the cards that Mikl chose, I'm just shocked that he missed this card. And maybe he was being respectful of cancel culture and the fact that Wizards banned this card and scrubbed it from existence, but it does still exist. This is a collector's edition Crusade. And this deck has how many white weenie creatures? Like 14 or something? A ridiculous amount. Sure, Crusade pumps their white guys, but you definitely have more white creatures than they do. And Crusade is so powerful in this deck. With all the banding creatures and stuff, it's so easy to assemble an offense that your opponent cannot answer without a full global sweeper. They can't block anything. And I think the card was just a huge oversight. I mean, compared to Army of Allah. Army of Allah is +2/+0. This is +1/+1 permanently to all your guys. And yeah, it doesn't have the element of surprise, but it costs 2 mana instead of 3. And it gives them toughness. It's so strong. And just anytime you draw Crusade, you just feel like your deck is unbeatable. Icy Manipulator, I replaced Ayla Pyle with this. It is just an all-around amazing card. It shows up in nearly every deck list, almost to the point where there might be some consideration of actually making it a pointed card, although it does cost 4. But Icy really, it seems kind of defensive, but it actually really furthers what this deck is trying to do. It has a mana denial plan in the form of Anka Mishra and Strip Mine and Vice and so on. And so you can tap your opponent's mana with it. You can also tap down 2 blockers, which makes it very, very hard for your opponent to really come back into the game if they're low in life. They need to keep multiple creatures back because you can tap 2 things and come through for damage. And I think just the overall flexibility of the card means that it's absolutely worth the 4 mana. Shatter, he chose to run Detonate over Shatter because of the fact that he was just thinking offensively. But I really think in this format you want as many good, efficient artifact kill spells as you possibly can manage, and Shatter is basically interchangeable with Disenchant and Divine Offering most of the time, and to me that just makes an auto-include. And finally, there's 2 more 1-point cards. There's Wheel of Fortune here is card number 8, and again, I think this was just another big flaw in the deck. It just does not have any ability to get back into the game after it's expended its hand. If your opponent is able to stop your early rush of things, you can just often wheel and draw 7 more cards and finish the game out. Plus, it's a way to just reactivate Black Vice and sometimes Anka Mishra as well to start ripping your opponent apart with those some more. And the fact that Mikl did not have Wheel of Fortune in his deck really allowed me to play differently against him when we played our match in the finals, because I never had to worry about the card. I never had to worry about this effect and losing any of the cards in my hand, which is a really, really big deal when you're playing a control deck. So I think this card at one point is just insane budget. It is so good. It's often totally asymmetric, where you draw 6 or something and they draw 2, and you lower your hand full of more threats and win right afterward. And then finally, the last card that I think belongs in the deck is Winter Orb, which is the last 1-point card. So you can see there's 2, 1, and 1 to replace the 4 points of Soul Ring. Winter Orb is exactly where this deck wants to be. The deck wants to play a bunch of early threats, and then at that point, and hopefully a bunch of these damaging artifacts, and then you just wait for an opportunity. Your opponent plays something at 4 or 5 mana, and hopefully you have a way to deal with it. Or even if you don't, you just play Winter Orb, you effectively destroy 5 of their lands for 2 mana, and you've still got all your land untapped, and they're just screwed from that point onward. And sure, it doesn't synergize perfectly with all the burn spells and so on, but it synergizes with so much of the deck's game plan that I think the card is excellent. And of course, with Icy Manipulator in the deck, you have the ability to trap your opponent under Winter Orb and have it totally not affect you by tapping it at the end of their turn. So those are the 9 cards I would have changed out of the original 60. But there's no arguing with how well this deck performed. Again, it went 5-0, 10-0 in the pod, and then it went 4-1 in games all the way up to the finals. And then I got to play against it myself. And how that turned out will be the subject for an upcoming video, or a series of upcoming videos, which hopefully you guys are looking forward to. That's it for my red-white deck tech. The next one I do will cover my blue-white control deck, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching.